Welcome, everybody. Thank you very much for this conference that you are attending. My name is Mark Stahlman. I am the president of the Center for the Study of Digital Life. I will unfortunately not be with you in Warsaw, but I will be attending from my headquarters here in New York City. My background is perhaps an interesting one for this particular conversation because of my father, who was a historian of ancient mathematics, was a protege of Norbert Wiener. Norbert Wiener was an American-born Jewish mathematician, considered by many to be among the most important in the 20th century. And Norbert Wiener and my father together at a party in Cambridge, Massachusetts, coined the term cybernetics. So we have cyber in our vocabulary as a result of my father and his work with his mentor, Norbert Wiener. Very importantly, Norbert Wiener, after publishing the book Cybernetics in 1948, which happens to have been the same year I was born, in 1950, he followed up with an even more important book, which is not as widely known today as it should be. The title of that book, as published, was The Human Use of Human Beings. Much like the citation from Greek mythology of Kybernetes, who became the origin of cybernetics, Wiener attempted to bring Pandora. Remember, Pandora's box was opening up all of the potential evils to the world. That was rejected by his publisher. He then attempted to invoke the name of Cassandra, Cassandra being the mythic figure who figures in Homer as being cursed with being able to predict the future, but no one would pay attention to her. A terrible circumstance, no doubt. This human use of human beings got Norbert Wiener in serious trouble, and he formed an organization called the Genius Project to try to pull together some unique minds in the hopes that their work would someday ultimately be important and widely regarded. That has not yet happened, but I believe we are now in the early stages of something along those lines. In particular, it turns out that the human use of human beings predicted the rise of artificial intelligence. That term had not even yet been coined in 1950. And we are now, of course, multiple decades, 50, 60 years plus, into a very aggressive effort to build artificial human beings. This has never happened before. For all of our interest in history, our interest in approaches that various people have taken, we are in completely new territory. We no longer live in the modern world as a result of this. This transition from the modern world into something quite new, which we simply call the digital paradigm, at the Center for the Study of Digital Life, where I am president, and CSDL is one of the sponsors of this conference, as you will see in the literature you have. It turns out that the most important thing that happens when we attempt to build artificial humans is we are compelled to then understand what it means to be an actual human. And so the effort that is underway with this conference and beyond to explore the topic of compassionate AI originates in the effort by the novelist, science fiction novelist, Philip K. Dick, and in particular in his novel Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. It turns out that P.K. Dick, who is the inspiration behind Hanson Robotics, who you will also be interacting with at this conference, he was very concerned about human beings' compassion. And so he designed a situation in which artificial humans, androids, had to be tested for this. His concern was not, however, the robots, it was the humans. This new paradigm is radically different in other ways. In addition to artificial humans, it has undone the overall geopolitical situation in which we have all lived and grown up. The notion that there would be one world economically, one world politically, one world spiritually, is now gone forever. Instead of lumping everything together in what Freud described as the oceanic feeling, we are now, in fact, being differentiated, we being divided. The technology does this to us regardless of what our own wishes might be. And so, in particular, as a result of the digital paradigm, we now live in a world in which there are three dominant global spheres, not one global system, but three. Those three systems we describe as East, West, and digital. The inclusion of digital is the first time that anyone has described this new digital group of human beings who wish to replace humans with artificial humans as a civilization on the par of the West and the East. Underlying each of these three spheres are technologies of communications. In particular, the East is based on a logogram or logographic writing technology, whereas the West is based on an alphabetic writing technologies. These technologies produce fundamentally different civilizations and cultures. The third sphere, the digital sphere, this in fact is based upon the writing technology of code. And I will quickly just mention, without detailing it more for you here, but we have publications on the CSDL website, which is digitallife.center, that describe some of this in more detail. But in fact, a logographic based civilization, the East, is now in the process, of attempting to recover the way, the Tao, whereas the alphabetic civilization of the West is now in the process of trying to recover the virtues. The third sphere, the digital sphere, is now in fact trying to recover what I would call the spark of alchemy. These three goals and the underlying technologies that drive them separate these three civilizations quite substantially, one from the other. They cannot be very simply reconciled. And as a result, dangers of conflict have increased quite dramatically. The Ukraine situation today is a direct result of these changes and cannot be understood apart from the digital paradigm. Naturally, you all have your views about Ukraine. Many of you probably are even directly, personally involved in that situation. I understand how you would then tend to uh, attempt to reconcile what is happening in your own lives with your own understandings, but I'm here to suggest to you that you will have to dig deeper and you will have to probably think this through in some other regards. There is no chance, I believe, that Russia would have declared war or is about to declare war, invaded Ukraine, had it not been for the split between East and West. The fact that there is an alternative to the global system, the New World Order system, which has placed sanctions on Russia, which they, of course, have rejected, and now, in fact, believe that they have moved beyond, is only possible because there is an East sphere. And furthermore, if it were not for the fact that there is a digital sphere, which is very much on the aggressive march in the midst of the situation, um, these sorts of dangers would not have come to the fore. And we are not done with war as a result of this. Furthermore, the role between the East and the West and digital, three spheres, in terms of COVID needs to be very carefully thought through. The notion this was simply originated in China and then spread worldwide is an inadequate understanding of the broader set of risks that we are now facing. And I do not believe that those dangers are over at this point either. This remembrance of what it means to be human is a part of the way that new technologies and the paradigms that they generate retrieve earlier sensibilities. So, in particular, digital has the inclination to retrieve sensibilities from an earlier time period. It can be referred to as the scribal time period, particularly as we got into the after the first millennium. And in the West, writing became something which was then no longer composed upon plants, but rather upon animal skins, vellum, and so forth, and therefore preserved. And so what we say is that digital retrieves the medieval. This is where the notion of virtues comes from. It's also where the notion of the way comes from for the East sphere. And it is also where the spark, the alchemical spark for the digital sphere, attempting to replace humans with something better, comes from. So in all three spheres, in different ways, we are now experiencing a retrieval of the medieval. This retrieval phenomenon is something that you're all quite familiar with. In fact, the previous electric paradigm retrieved an even earlier sensibility. That would be the sensibility of the oral world. And so mythology, what Jung referred to as collective unconscious, these are all pre-literate, pre-scribal notions. And they were retrieved very widely and became important in the composition of the previous paradigm. We are not doing that anymore. We're doing something new and different. So the opportunity that we all now have in this new paradigm, in which we are remembering what it means to be human, has profound psychological, sociological, political, economic, and technological implications. I hope this conference has an opportunity to explore some of these important issues. By looking at the question of compassionate AI, we are forced to address the question that Philip K. Dick raised about compassionate human beings. And so I congratulate the GAIA Foundation. I congratulate the think tank and those who are assembling here for this conference. We are dealing with very fundamental questions. We have a great deal of work to do to understand this world in which we now live, and a great deal of work to do with each other to try to make the world a safer place. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. Like always, you just started talking and it's fly. Okay, I have a few questions. Mark, you said something which I'm not sure if I understand properly. You mentioned that, if I understand that, the communication technology implicate our civilization. Like you said that
Yes.
writing, word, etc., etc. It's mean
Right.
the way how we communicate, the same way we create our world around us.
It actually is a very important question. Thank you very much. We have, I think, inaccurately believed that we create the world around us. This is called constructionism by some in social science. In many ways, it is exactly the opposite. We do not create the world creates us. And this process of designing the human based upon the technological environment, obviously, we do not live in a natural environment. You and I are not talking naked to each other sitting in the forest someplace. There's an enormous amount of technology, from our clothes to the headphones and the cameras and all the rest. We're in a very artificial environment, and that environment is the one in which our children are born. So what happens in the human being as they are brought into this world is, as you know, they do not have language. They do not have structures. They must first, of course, learn how to speak. And then, at a very early age, we compel them to learn how to write. In an alphabetic society, that would be learning your ABCs, a very difficult task. And then we, in fact, immerse them in a whole series of other technologies. So, the notion of constructionism, that we are able to build a world as we wish it to be, now must be discarded. Instead, we must come to grips with the fact that we are constructed by the grammars of the technologies as languages into which we grow up. This happens, by the way, in chronological terms, according to the Piaget structure of development, roughly in the ages, say, between 8 and 12. So that is to say, the final phase of development before biological puberty prepares us for reproduction. He called it the concrete operational in the series of various phases, and it needs to much more carefully be looked into. I have 2 children, and so I've observed in my own family's case and with others how this operates. I should probably underscore here also, this may provoke another question, another mistake, in addition to the constructionist mistake that we have made, is the notion that human beings are information processors. They are not. And so we have a great deal of mistaken social science that will now need to be reimagined and, in fact, reinvented. New paradigms, as described by Thomas Kuhn in his 1962 Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Very importantly, new paradigms mean new sciences. And so we are now at the beginning of developing, and one of the more important tasks we will have is coming up with new sciences. And I don't just mean social sciences. I also mean we will need new physics, new chemistry, new mathematics. We have an enormous task ahead of us to come to grips with this new paradigm.
What do you think? How the life will look like in this new paradigm?
Aha.
Uh-huh.
Well, probably most importantly is that we will reorganize things in an autonomous way. So what we're trying to do, of course, with these androids is we're attempting to build autonomous machines. A colleague of mine, a fellow at my center, actually has published an excellent book on this. His name is Bill Davidow. The title of the book is The Autonomous Revolution. So you could describe the underlying technological thrust. Bill Davidow, by the way, is a very well-known, renowned Silicon Valley venture capitalist. So he is in the middle of that technology business. And he recognizes that what we're doing now is we're building autonomy into our machines. That means, if we are correct, that the human beings will wind up taking their cue from the technology, and the technology will construct us to become more autonomous. So I would say the single most important characteristic of what the world already looks like, I do my best to not try to make predictions, but rather to describe the world we already live in. We're already highly autonomous. So what that means is that the institutions of the past, institutions on the political scale, such as the European Union, institutions on the economic scale, such as the World Trade Organization and the sanctions associated with it, those no longer have the force or stability or coherence that they once had and will wind up being replaced. What this will mean is what is called subsidiarity. That may be an unfamiliar term. It turns out to have been written into the Maastricht Treaty, so it is actually the basis of the organization of the EU. However, the EU has not followed through. So the exit by Britain, the threats by various others to leave, is because the EU did not follow its own goals. Subsidiarity means that decisions will be reached at the lowest possible level consistent with the responsibilities that are involved. Some things occur at the family level. Some things occur at all sorts of intermediate institutional levels. Some things occur necessarily because the responsibilities are global. They occur on a global level. This change is an enormous one. The notion that we should all wind up worrying about how the world is run now is no longer valid. It's become obsolete. We do not have responsibilities on that level. And so the reorganization of the structures of the world political economy along the lines of subsidiarity are already well underway. And one of the key components of that is the question of charity. So compassion, which is a active expression of the virtue of charity will wind up coming back in a much stronger fashion. As it turns out, the West has a much more developed understanding of charity than does the East. And so alliances between spheres may be necessary to deal with the questions of charity. This is not something that I am projecting. I am not describing something that will happen 10 or 20 years from now. I'm describing something that has already happened. We are 20 plus years into this new paradigm.
Can you give me the example of to prove your theory? Because now you're saying that we are living in the future, in which we start to be more compassion, live in more charity world, and at the same time, look, the Ukraine war and the people are still killing each other. We are killing Mother Earth, just what we are doing with climate changing. It's horrible. I couldn't find the charity and the love and compassion in our history, at least from the last 20 years.
Well, but of course, Ukraine has brought an enormous outpouring of charity, and the Poles have been particularly focused on all of this. Now, let's remember here.
Yeah, that's right.
Poland is at a very important and fundamental level, regardless of how people might express themselves in their daily lives. It is a Catholic country. And it turns out that there are three theological virtues associated with the Catholic Church: faith, hope, and charity. The charitable expressions of the Polish people in relationship to their neighbors in Ukraine have been an enormous outpouring here, probably more so than the rest of the world. Furthermore, behind the scenes and on the basis of charitable relations, the Pope has been a very significant interlocutor in attempting to resolve this conflict. So, as I said before, we have shifted from one paradigm, which became unstable, which became incoherent, which became, on the basis of its sciences, unable to deal with the challenges. We are now in a new paradigm. Now, that presents all sorts of risks associated with it. And so the new risk situation is something that I'm hoping one of the spin-offs of my center called Exogenous Inc. Website is just Exogenous Inc., one word.com, or EXO. We're hoping to help people understand the new risks associated with this. So the outpouring of virtues is being showcased by these situations. The bureaucratic or centralized response is supplying weapons. The bureaucratic or centralized response to COVID supplied all sorts of lockdowns and all sorts of measures that were not in any way charitable. And so we're living in a conflict here, a conflict between the old paradigm, which is centralized, bureaucratic, and inhumane, and a new paradigm, which winds up being radically different in all of those parameters. So I think your question is excellent. We are living, in fact, in a laboratory to experience this shift in our overall sensibilities.
It's interesting what you say, that we are living like laboratory mouse, but with reality instead of some crazy doctors. Okay, and one of the last question: what is the most important question or problems which should be solved now if we want to push human race further?
Right. You brought up the question of climate change and the mobilization, as you know very well, around the topic of climate change has been quite unsatisfactory. That is to say, the centralized one world approach of the previous paradigm has proved itself completely incapable of addressing climate change. We have been through many major international meetings. We have been through a series of attempts and scientific experiments. They have failed. We will not address climate change that way. In the new paradigm, in contrast, because we have a new sensibility about ourselves, our society, and the broader world, we have for the first time an actual opportunity to deal with these sorts of issues, but on a radically different basis. So therefore, the existential risk to humanity has shifted. As always happens in a paradigm change, the underlying sensibility changes. And so our sensibility, as you put it, that we were attacking Mother Earth, that is no longer the sensibility. That is not a human-centered sensibility, in fact. And that is a sensibility that has led to these incapability of confronting the larger issues. Governments getting together to make resolutions is not going to fix this problem. It will take individual human beings changing their approach to life. So therefore, Eddie, answering your question, the single most important question that we all must now answer is, what does it mean to be a human being? In particular, what does it mean to have a soul? To the extent that we live in a world in which the notion of soul has been separated from our lives, has been put off into the corner someplace, has been relegated to an older way of thinking, it now must come back. So the question is, what is a human soul? And in particular, what qualities does it have? Therefore, human compassion, which is being studied by you and your colleagues in the GAIA think tank, becomes the single most important question going forward. We have replaced the old concerns of climate change, which we have not been able to address, with a new set of concerns, existential concerns for the human race. What does it mean to be a human? And what comes out of that winds up being a renewed emphasis on the topic of charity, love, and compassion, changing us in our own personal sensibilities, retraining us in a fashion that would correspond to digital retrieving the medieval. It's happening all around the world. This is not something that it makes any sense to fight against. In fact, it cannot be resisted. Digital technology has brought us to a situation where we think we can build artificial humans. That then compels us to ask the question, what does it mean to be a real human? That's the most important question for us today.
Thank you very much, Mark.